Look, up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. Oh no, wait, it is a plane. It's a jet. But what's that behind it?
From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now, or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
This week, we are returning to examine a topic we looked at early on in the history of our show. And as you could tell from the opening of this episode, we are looking at not contrails, but chemtrails. Surely this is familiar to you. It's one of the conspiracy theories that the vast majority of the Western public is aware of. Quick and dirty gist goes like this. So every time you will see a jet that leaves a striped-shaped cloud behind it, it's typically said to be a contrail, at least according to governments and according to institutions like NASA and the majority of independent scientists around the world. However, since the 1990s, people have believed that there's a similar but much more dangerous thing called a chemtrail. Instead of a string of harmless water vapor and jet exhaust byproducts, these things contain lithium or barium or other chemicals designed for one of several purposes: to impair the cognitive functions of an unsuspecting public, to irradiate the ground for some reason, to provide cover from satellites or radar, and on and on and on. In the mainstream, these notions are often dismissed as crackpot theories and bunk, and you will be hard-pressed to find universally accepted truth of a modern chemtrail conspiracy. In our podcast this week, in our audio podcast, which you can find at stufftheydon'twantyoutoKnow.com, Noel, Matt, and I take a closer look at the arguments for and against the existence of chemtrails, and in the course of our investigation, we discovered something very much like the chemtrail theory, and absolutely true. Here are 5 examples. Number 1, in 1950, the US government conducted war games in the Bay Area, so San Francisco and the surrounding areas, wherein they attempted to measure the feasibility of the use of aerosol agents as a weapon of war. This means spraying something, right? A radiation, a biological agent out into the weather and just seeing what happens. Will this work? How do we fight against it? That would be, the common line of defense argument. Or how do we weaponize it? Number 2, over the course of March and April in 1952, the government also conducted experiments in South Carolina and Georgia, attempting to see how weather would affect the dispersal of aerosol agents when launched from the ground. So San Francisco was launching from offshore to test the feasibility, and this was launching from the ground to see how the weather affected it. Let's jump a little further ahead and let's go to a different country. Number 3, in 1957, the government conducted experiments in the North Sea. That's the east coast of Britain. And these experiments were successful, according to the records we found. Why were they successful? Because they were attempting to prove the feasibility of an aerosol agent being dispersed to a population or across an area of land, regardless of meteorological activity. And they found that it was feasible. And this leads to example number 4. Same year, December 2nd, 1957, we see the inaugural flight of something called Operation LAC, or Large Area Coverage. In this operation, the U.S. military borrowed an aircraft from the U.S. Air Force. It was a C-119, aka a flying boxcar, and they loaded it with zinc cadmium sulfide, and they flew this aircraft from South Dakota to Minnesota. And along the way, they dispersed thousands of pounds of this agent to see how it spread, how the wind affected it, how the air pressure affected it, or the humidity, and so on. And they measured or tracked the spread of these particles through the use of ground stations, because the zinc cadmium sulfide they were using was fluorescent, so it was easily tracked. And what they found was this stuff spread more than 1,000 miles away. Some of it even went into Canada. The argument here, on behalf of the government was that this was an exercise to see what would happen if the other side, and let's remember this is during the Cold War, so the other side would be the USSR, Soviet Russia. They wanted to see what would happen if the other side launched an attack. That's the logic here. For more information on this experiment, on Operation LAC, Operation DO, and other related projects, check out the book, The 11th Plague. It comes highly recommended. But there's one more left, and it may be the most important, and it may be the most disturbing, and we're going to jump back in time for this one. Number 5, 1953 through 1954 in St. Louis. At this point, the government had a lot of the operation down, the methodology behind it. You spray an area, a city, with zinc cadmium sulfide, and then you watch how it spreads and measure that and use that in your later war games or your strategies or your model building. But this time, there was something different. According to Professor Lisa Martino-Taylor, St. Louis got a bit of an upgrade. In addition to the zinc that they were getting, there was another thing added to it, something that the military called FP2266. And according to Martino-Taylor's research, FP2266 was a name for a compound that contained a couple things: a silicate, but more importantly, a substance called radium-226, a radioactive substance supplied by a company called, in a burst of creativity, the U.S. Radium Corporation. So this irradiated material was spread around St. Louis. It was spread from rooftops. It was spread from the ground. There were mobile stations set up in station wagons that would drive around, stop, spread this stuff. And they were spreading it in primarily minority, primarily low-income communities. There's convincing evidence that this did in fact occur, and that it occurred to target these populations specifically. You can also find reports online and in historical records of people suffering ill health effects, because that's what happens when someone sprays radium on you. Thanks so much for watching. We'd like to hear from you. Do you have any other instances of the U.S. government or governments abroad conducting similar experiments? Do you feel that you have evidence for the existence of chemtrails? Let us know in the comments below. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter, where we are Conspiracy Stuff. And if you have any suggestions for an upcoming show, or just don't feel like talking in the public echo chambers of the internet, why not send us an email directly? We are conspiracy@howstuffworks.com.